Today, I'm excited to introduce you to Dr. Elaine Treharne, the Roberta Bowman Denning Professor of the Humanities, Professor of English, Robert K. Packard University Fellow in Undergraduate Education, Director of Stanford Text Technologies, and former Director of the Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis. Elaine was also recently appointed Senior Associate Vice Provost of the Office of the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education. Her main research focuses on early medieval British manuscripts, Old and Middle English religious poetry and prose, and the history of handwriting. She is a popular faculty leader for Stanford travel study programs. In 2023, she'll lead England, a literary journey in June, and United Kingdom Wales Walk in August. I first met Professor Traharne on my first day as a Stanford student, as she was serving as the resident fellow for my freshman dorm, Twain. Over the following years, I worked with her on projects at CESTA when she was director, traveled with her as part of a 3-week overseas seminar tracing place names across England, and finally served as her resident assistant at Inghouse in the 2018-2019 school year. So if you're considering that travel study program, as someone who traveled both to England and Wales with Elaine, I can't recommend it highly enough. Throughout my time at Stanford, Elaine was always a source of critical guidance and intellectual rigor, who pushed the boundaries of how I thought about the interplay between digital tools and the humanities, and who always encouraged critical reflection and further exploration. I'm excited to be here with you today to continue that journey and looking forward to learning more about the history and influence of medieval manuscripts. Elaine, over to you.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks so much. Yes, Claire and I have a long history, and we have seen many amazing sites together. And hopefully this will be an interesting talk for somebody who I've worked with already for years. So I'm going to talk about, I'm assuming you can all hear me, or somebody would have shouted at me by now, but I'm going to try and do a little bit of justice to the topic of the history and influence of manuscripts. But of course, in putting this slideshow together, I quickly realized that I could keep you here for hours. I won't. I will whiz through some things, but we have some resources for you to follow up, and there are a number of pointers that I will make as we make our way through the presentation. So I'm going to share my screen with you. I have a presentation. And so my opening slide is asking you to consider what you imagine when you think about a medieval manuscript, because whatever you imagine, I'm pretty sure it's not what's right in front of you now, which is the verso. It's the back side of a folio that you can tell has got, tantalizingly, has got writing on. It's not a palimpsest, it's offset from the other side of the leaf. And this particular side, this verso, was left blank. But blankness in itself is fascinating. It's potential. So where you see white space or blankness, it's potential for the scribes. It's a sign of the things that are already there already here in this case. And you can imagine scribes doing their very best to fill this empty space if they came across it in a manuscript. Well, rather than this, I think when you think of when one thinks of a medieval manuscript, one might really think of something more along these lines. So this is a book of hours. It's a prayer book that was owned by sort of gentry, sort of lower aristocracy, and created originally around 1300. So when I think the kind of popular version or vision of the medieval manuscript is something that is illuminated, which means it's decorated with gold leaf, rich colors and pigments, it's illustrated, and it has some form of writing that in the case here, Gothic writing is very familiar to us. And if you watch any of these historical shows from the Vikings to the Last Kingdom, you will see at points in the episodes manuscripts like this being copied out by scribes, or at least attempts at manuscripts like this being copied out by scribes. So this is a kind of much more typical idea of a medieval manuscript. And right now at Stanford, in Green Library, in the Munger Rotunda and Peterson Galleries, we have an exhibition called The Handmade Book, which I curated along with Dr. Ben Albritton, who's the curator of rare books and manuscripts at Stanford, and Deirdre Fazell, the exhibitions officer. And this is we've decorated the pillars. As you can see, we have 18 cases of medieval manuscripts paired with artists' books to provide a synergy that is all to do with the idea of the handmade. So we're in a particular phase, as you'll see as we go through this slideshow, we're in a particular phase of book history where the handmade has once again become very important in culture, literary and historical and bibliographical culture. So also in this exhibition, this is one of the cases. This is a case called Book as Body. We're focusing on the handmade, and in particular in this case, we're focusing on handwriting, because a manuscript, even in terms of the etymology of the word manuscript, denotes anything that is written by hand. So it doesn't have to be a book. It can be any form. As you can see here, we've got 2 pieces of animal skin at the back in that large beautiful piece by the scribe Cheryl Jacobson. We have 2 animal skins sewn together she took my quotation, handwriting is the presence of absence, and created this really remarkable work. And at the bottom in the zigzag that you can see there is an accordion book by graduate student Luca Massara, who was also instrumental in putting together this exhibition. And he took Song of Myself, the poem by Walt Whitman, and he had travelers on the Los Angeles metro translate lines from Song of Myself into Spanish. So the work is called Canción de M, and each entry is in a different form of handwriting depending on the traveler who contributed to this overall project. So what this already starts to show us is that manuscripts, the handwritten, can come in all shapes and sizes. And in this case here, representing bodies, the bodies of those who are inscribed into these books. And so when we think about the manuscript and its representation of those who are not present, except through their handwriting, we begin to get an intimation of the influence of the medieval. Because in the medieval period, and this is a very famous manuscript called the Exeter Book of Old English Poetry, dating from the second half of the 10th century, possibly written in the Southwest, maybe Exeter or Glastonbury. In this period in the 10th century, books had spiritual significance as well as educational and symbolic significance. And in this particular poem, which you can see, it's written out as if it looks like prose, written out as if it were prose, but it's actually Old English poetry. This M on the left-hand side here is the start of a riddle that is all about a spiritual book, a holy book, and quite likely a gospel book. And it tells us the story of that book's creation from the animal skin itself. And I have here, if this is an antiphonal or it's a book of late medieval music, and you can hear me unfolding it, very noisy. That is one animal skin. So in this case, probably calf. So it comes from a calf, and this poem tells us the story of how the animal died in order to give life to this book, and that this book itself, in this case a gospel book, will give life to those who read and enjoy it. And it's a particularly influential poem for me because my most recent book, Perceptions of Medieval Manuscripts, is guided, if you like, by this poem, in that the stages of the creation of a book form the basis of each chapter that I write about. So the body of the animal influences the body of humanity in this case, and yet has other influences, as you can see from this modern hotel in Exeter that is influenced by the Exeter book. And they've turned the poem, The Wanderer, the Old English poem, The Wanderer, here into a rug upon which people walk. So the first line of the poem from the Old English Exeter book has been used to create this carpet. So manuscript history, as you can tell just from this piece that's influenced by a 10th century manuscript history is much more complex, and the influences of manuscripts much more varied than I can show. And in the next sort of 20 or so minutes, I'm going to focus principally on Western manuscripts and even more on Western, I suppose, manuscripts that are predominated by a Christian impulse. That's because that's basically what I work on. But of course, manuscript history is worldwide. It's global. All cultures have a form of manuscript or recording, with some exceptions in terms of Native American or Aboriginal people. So other than that, many cultures rather have manuscript and recording traditions. And in this instance, this is an Ethiopian, probably late 19th century prayer book that also acts kind of protectively. So it's a totemic object that acts to protect its user, its reader, and possibly its wearer. And this is also made of animal skin, as you can see close up in this unique manifestation that each manuscript represents. Shows us something of the international nature of book production. And the history of the book itself is obviously still very much kind of being explored. In this case, this appears to be a very, very early form of book. Now, in order to define the nature of a book, that could take us weeks. In fact, I have taught classes of 10 weeks that focus only on that question of what is a book, or what constitutes the materiality of a book. And in this case, this Etruscan book is made out of thin but fairly sort of sturdy sheets of gold, upon which is handwritten or hand illustrated scenes from contemporary life. And one might say that what constitutes the book in this case are multiple parts that are bound in some way. And I think that probably allows us to think most coherently about the book. A book is comprised of multiple parts that in some way have a binding. And that seems fairly obvious, but when you see some of the artists' books that are created from the 19th century onwards, and particularly in the last century or so, they really take that definition of the book to extremes. And we have a lot of those artist books on display in the Green Library here at Stanford in this exhibition that I mentioned, the handmade book. So the very early history of the book then could go back into this BCE period by some centuries, but really the form of the book as we know it, this in a codex shape with a binding, really takes off just in the early centuries, Anno Domini, the early centuries of the Common Era, when it became the predominant form for the spread of both Christianity and Islam. Judaic religions in these early periods tended, and still do, of course, use scroll technologies. And what is particularly remarkable about the manuscript as a book form is its variability, its flexibility. So really, I'm going to talk to you a little bit now about flexibility as an overarching component of the history of the book and the form of the book. So we can go from something like this multi-leaved, bound golden book, to a gigantic book, conveniently called, known by the label, the Codex Gigas, this gigantic book, which is 2.91 feet, a whole animal skin per leaf, times 1.6 feet. So you can see you've got scale because of the people standing right behind it there. And this is obviously a page depicting a demon in quite glorious form. And this was made probably in the 12th or 13th centuries, although we know very little about its origin. We know that monks of the Abbey of Podacier in Eastern Europe pawned this manuscript to the monastery of Sedlec towards the end of the 13th century. And one of the things that is most fascinating to consider is how many folios could a scribe copy a day. And it's been worked out that if it's one scribe copying out this manuscript, must have been a very sort of penitential act. If this scribe wrote 106 lines per day, which is the number of lines per folio, and worked for 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, this particular book would have taken that scribe 5 years to complete. So it's really extraordinary to think about the time and the effort that goes into the production of the manuscript, and indeed of anything handmade. So we're going to think about flexibility, we're going to think about craft, and we're going to think about desire when we consider the history and influence of the medieval manuscript. By contrast, and really it's a dramatic contrast and highlighting what I am saying about the variability or flexibility of form, is this particular book, where for scale, we need not a human being, but in fact, it's my hand. So hands are always good for showing the scale of a book. And I have the exact, hang on, where's my camera? Okay, we have the exact replica of this book that I'm showing you in my hand. Let me just bring this up to the camera. So see if you can see the size of the write. It's absolutely minuscule. It's the tiniest imaginable handwriting. And this is not a gimmick. This was not a book written as a gimmick. It's a 9th century Psalter, a book of Psalms written for the Bishop of Salzburg in Austria, modern Austria, Bishop Rupert. It's bound with this Coptic binding, like the Ethiopian prayer book I was just showing you. And it's bound in oak boards, so very thin oak boards. So this is an exact replica of that manuscript, and it fits precisely in the palm of my hand and would fit into a small bag that one could wear around the neck as if it were a locket. And it is legible. It is fully legible and complete. A remarkable work of art that shows, let me just show you the back of the binding here, a remarkable work of art that shows the ingenuity of the scribes in this early medieval period, and also the potentiality of the form of the book and for all these varying functions. And this book inspired, not this particular book, but this size of book has inspired, there's a whole trade in miniature books, contemporary miniature books, as well as earlier ones. And in the exhibition that I'm mentioning is this work, The Mystical Quality of Handwork, is this particular issue, where the makers, Peter and Donna Thompson, have really manipulated the variability of the form of the book as we understand it, using both scroll format and book format in the production of a multi-volume miniature set of works. So playing around with the form of the book, as these modern artists do, is not just in terms of the physical makeup of the book, but also in terms of page layout. And the influence of medieval manuscripts on contemporary book production cannot be underestimated. I think when we think about contemporary books, 21st century books that we buy or that we read online or on our tablet technologies, we think we're looking at something that was influenced in the West by, for example, Gutenberg. But actually, Gutenberg himself, as we'll see in a minute, based his form of early print in the West on medieval manuscripts. So what tends to happen with technologies is that they contain things familiar from previous technologies. We can think of it as sedimentation, skeuomorphism, the use of preceding technologies to influence contemporary and innovative technologies. And in the 12th century, we begin to see, 12th and 13th century, we begin to see remarkable things happening to book formats as the universities emerge and scholars start interacting with texts in books like this Bible, with these rich commentaries going on in between the main columns of the text that you can see in front of you. The different sizes of handwriting on this folio tell you the function of the individual pieces of the page. And manuscript scholars talk about books like this, which is from St. Albans in the very late 12th or early 13th century, talk about books like this as being scholastic and and complex in terms of their layout. And it requires concentration both to create and also obviously to read. Each different column that comments on the main large handwriting has an explicatory function. It's explaining what's going on in these Gospels. But also you'll notice at the top of the folio, you can see secundum Mattheum. So just right at the very top, in the middle of the left and the middle of the right hand leaf, secundum Mattheum. So this is the Gospel of Matthew. And you can also see a number, Roman numerals, in the top right hand corner of the leaf on the right. So in the 12th and into the 13th centuries, we begin to see information retrieval tools like running headers and some form of pagination or foliation, as well as dividing into columns, happen in terms of the way that books are laid out. And again, anyone reading a contemporary book, printed or handwritten, will be familiar with these ways to move around the page. So by the time we're in the sort of high Middle Ages, we are looking at medieval manuscripts with ruling and columns and commentary and page numbers and running headers, where it's possible to see that in real terms, the form of the book has changed very little in the last 1,000 years, except, of course, through mechanization. And here is another kind of good example of something that is so very obviously a book with wide margins, which one might imagine invites commentary by somebody interacting with the book. And those of you who remember taking library books out, or who still take library books out, where somebody has used a highlighter pen, or I don't know, underlined or ringed something in pencil or in ballpoint pen, that is it's considered one of the, I don't know, most heinous things to do, especially to books that don't belong to you, but actually belong to the library. But in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period, commentating and annotating or interacting with your books was absolutely invited. And this is probably the earliest manuscript of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It's at the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth in West Wales, and manuscript Penyath 392D. It's called the Hen Gwrt Chaucer, after the place of donorship. And the margins, as you'll notice, look particularly clear, except for the heading on the left-hand side here of the Cook's Tale. That's what's in the margin there of the Cook's Tale. But recent work by Professor Andrew Prescott at the University of Glasgow and me, using but the naked eye and a magnifying glass, suggests that, in fact, these margins, probably in the earlier 20th century, which might have been filled with scribes and compilers, annotations and clues to the way to put this book together, were washed clean in order to present a pristine book at the book sales. So we prefer, and this is a very modern phenomenon, we prefer to see the books that we acquire clean copies, fine copies, copies without somebody else's efforts at explanation in the margins. And that is particularly true, I think, of manuscript books. And you can see from that Hen Gwrt Chaucer to this fabulous kind of Star Wars picture of a leaf from the Gutenberg Bible circa 1455, you can see that the margins are, the pristineness of the margins is maintained. And you can also see here what we would call hybrid technology, in that the black writing is printed using mechanical type from Gutenberg's press, but the blue and red that you can see, the tipped in capitals and the decorative capital there in blue is hand done. So it's part manuscript and part print. And for the first 50 years after the invention of print in the west of Europe, we call this the incunabular period. It's the period, it's the cradle of print. And it's a time when it was this hybrid technology of manuscript and print combined to produce these books that, to all intents and purposes, look exactly the same as the medieval manuscripts that have preceded them by some many hundreds of years. For me, the difference between manuscript up to the present day, and of course, as I sit in my classrooms with students, they very often take notes in their notebooks as opposed to on their laptops. So one can think about manuscript culture continuing to the present day with pen or pencil and paper, or even stylus and tablet. That now you can buy tablets where the surface emulates the feel of paper. For me, the difference is that print, and I'm happy to argue this point if you like, but print resists intimacy, whereas manuscript insists on intimacy, whether it's down to the follicle of the hair of the animal skin itself, to the slightest trace or touch of a person who moved their way through the books. And so intimacy is something that I think is very particular to and important for manuscript culture. And in books, this is a stunning book. Those are fields of lapis lazuli blue, ultramarine blue that you can see here. Very famous manuscript called the Berry Bible, Cambridge Corpus Christi College 2, written in the 12th century and massive. It's huge. You can see writing on the book that Moses is holding up, or tablets, or it looks book-like, that Moses is holding up. But if I show you a close-up, you can see that somebody has come along and written Moses and Moisen and other notes and annotations into the fields of the verdigris and ultramarine itself. And that kind of the intimacy that is created between book, interactor with the book, and modern reader of the book, I think brings us close to the past in a way that most other manifestations of the past suggest, but don't demand in the way that medieval manuscripts do. And one of my favorite examples of this is another very famous manuscript, the Stockholm Codex Aureus, or Golden Book. And this was written in the 8th century. The gold letters, the capitals that you can see there, starting with the name of Christ, the Cairo in the top left of the framed writing. This was written in the 8th century, but the writing around the frame in that thin lowercase script is 9th century. And what it actually records at the very top of the folio here is the names of Alfred the alderman and Werburg, his wife, who redeemed this book from the heathen army with their own pure or clean money. And then they took this book that was being held ransom by the Viking invaders of southern England. They paid for this book with their own money that they're really at pains to say was not tainted money. And they gave the book back to Christ Church Canterbury in order to ask for the redemption of their souls. So again, the intimacy that this book demands of us through the writing of these names and the association of these names with the opening of St. Matthew's Gospel is really quite remarkable, and shows us the ways in which this book was regarded in its own day, and hardly surprisingly, as treasure to be stolen by the Vikings and to be ransomed by the alderman Alfred and his family, in the hope of saving their souls, recognizing that one stores up treasure, etc., in that kind of Christian tradition. So these manuscripts, and this is a book binding that belonged to the Gospel Book of Judith, Countess of Flanders, in the 11th century, and it's now at the Morgan Library in New York. Books then as now that are meant for praise of the divine or as gifts to very important or senior spiritual or lay people, were these treasures and regarded in their own time as treasures. And it wasn't just a case of inscribing an acknowledgement of the value of the book into the production of the book itself, but also for the salvation of your soul, having your own name written into books. And again, you know, the intimacy that this creates between the scribe who represents the people that they write into the book and the reader or receiver of these books in the present day is quite remarkable. And what you see in this book, which is the Durham Liber Vitae, so this is a book of names from Durham that runs through many hundreds of years. What you can see is this kind of rushing or crowd of names to try and ensure that their names are read out in masses at Durham Monastery, Durham Cathedral, and that salvation is assured for these people. So this is a Liber Vitae, or Book of Lives, that reminds us of the Book of Life in the New Testament Book of Revelation. But again, it brings us into close proximity to the surging of people as they seek kind of community salvation itself. Something much more personal are the many, many notes and annotations that we find written into manuscripts from this entire period and into the early modern period and into the modern period, as people write their names into their books, often multiple times per book. So you'll write your name not just once, but a number of times. And in this particular example, which is Cambridge Trinity College manuscript, in the right-hand margin, halfway down, right-hand folio halfway down, is this inscription, and it's just here on the right where this decorative note denoter is. Hitch am Michel of Arras will sona I awyrth de alas. So I'm Michael of Arras, and I'm going to soon be forgotten, alas. But of course, Michael of Arras has not been forgotten because he wrote his name into a book, and the permanence of the book, the value that we ascribe to books, kind of makes sure that his name continues forward. But, you know, it's not just, you know, the kind of treasure of the past that is left in the past. The treasure of the past is valued now, but valued in really extraordinary ways. And this just brings me to my final section on craft and desire. And the desire to have something of the past that we ourselves own has really been motivational in the 19th and 20th centuries, in particular in relation to the influence that medieval manuscripts have, both for craft people, but also in the desire of book collectors. And this is a destroyed 19th century late 19th, early 20th century lampshade, the panels of which were made up of a late medieval antiphonal or music book. And it went on fire. So the vellum is really very badly destroyed. It's actually on my desk over there. So if you wanted to see it, come to my office. And I'm watching it, I'm curating its decay. And so many books were cut up and fragmented through history. And again, particularly in the 19th and the 20th centuries. And what you see in front of you is in my hand. It is a book that was constructed from the fragments of previously existing medieval manuscripts, actually by Judge Walter Beals, who was part of the Nuremberg trials. And similarly, even on eBay right now, medieval books that were whole as you know, as short a time ago as 10 or so years are being sold and cut up. And again, this belongs to me, and I did not cut it up. It was cut up by a German book dealer in 2013 and sold piecemeal on eBay, and contains the most extraordinary remnants of a rich book of hours from about 1460. Very little of it remains now. But just, you know, you can see from the effort that has gone into the medieval artists' production of this depiction of David the psalmist, how brutal these acts of desire for a piece of the past actually are. But the blue that you see in these folios here, in this folio, let me just show you the actual, oops, where's my camera? There it is. That's the actual folio. The desire is, of course, for the beauty and the craftsmanship of these books. And so in this case, we're looking at a blue that is lapis lazuli. And part of the influence of medieval manuscripts is on the development of new technologies for ascertaining the makeup of pigments and the ability to describe colors. Because medieval manuscript pigments are stable over so many centuries, they're really incredibly useful for helping us to think through technologies and representations of color. And at the Fitzwilliam Museum website, if you type in something like the craft of illumination, they have this incredible project that they did where they imaged and magnified times 20 pigments on pages like this Reichenau epistolary to analyze the pigments that were used. And this is ultramarine, that is crushed lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. From the 10th century, this was imported in the production of this book, which is really remarkable. And you might remember this story, in fact, that made the global international headlines of a 10th century nun whose skeletal remains included in her teeth the embedding right here in the middle of a piece of lapis lazuli, likely because she was an illuminator of manuscripts and would use these pigments and perhaps lick the brush, thin brush that she was using to do the decorative work. So this ultramarine, this crushed lapis lazuli really is prominent in the production of medieval manuscripts. And this is a beautiful medieval manuscript, again from the Fitzwilliam Museum, called the Pabenham Clifford Book of Hours, so called because of the people for whom it was made, who had themselves inscribed, as you can see on the left-hand folio here, had themselves illustrated into the book, in this case on the page of the Holy Trinity with the symbols of the evangelists in the corner. There they are. Pabenham and Joan Clifford, John de Pabenham on the right and Joan Clifford, his wife, who got married in 1315. It's likely that this book was presented to them at this time. So we have these rich gold leaf illuminations, the decorative, humorous depictions of agricultural life, cultural life, heraldic life in the late medieval period, the 14th century, on the right-hand side. And it becomes this extraordinary representation of the wealth and the treasured way in which books for the aristocracy and the high-level gentry were produced in this period. But this book is really significant because it's been through this process of magnification and pigment analysis by the Fitzwilliam. And this is mosaic gold that makes up the wings of the eagle of the evangelist St. John. But this very manuscript was owned by one of the most influential figures in the last 200 or so years, and that is the arts and crafts progenitor, William Morris. And he owned this, and the British designer, artist, architect, writer, socialist, bookmaker, owner of the Kelmscott Press. He owned this and many other manuscripts, which, as you can see from his own work, heavily influenced the way that he conceived of the book. And so he himself produced manuscripts. So these are his own calligraphic and manuscript representations in the very late 19th century, the third quarter of the 19th century, and he died in 1897. And you can see the ways in which the medieval manuscript here on the left, which is one that I found that I think is relatively similar in terms of the decorative motifs to his edition of Horace's Odes, which was published in facsimile. And you can see how very similar that is to medieval manuscripts. So not only did he buy manuscripts, but he also worked regularly at the British Library in the 19th century that was housed within the British Museum. And he depicted in this image, which is at the Tate Gallery, La Belle Iseult, a medieval missal or mass book on the desk in front of Iseult in this picture. And my colleague Paul Acker has spent a good amount of time identifying this very manuscript. And so William Morris, in his influence on arts and crafts and the emergence of calligraphy and book production as a fine art in the late 19th century, reflecting on the dehumanization of the Industrial Revolution. So this was a kind of revolt against the mechanization and dehumanization that came from 19th century mechanical processes. And he really influenced the 20th century and scholarship in the 20th century on medieval manuscripts in ways that are only just beginning to become apparent. And it may be the topic of my next book, we'll see. So this is Morris himself emulating writing from, that would look like sort of 14th century writing and these decorative marginal motifs of the dragon. And it really influenced his own production for the Kelmscott Press in the 1890s. Of course, these books sell for many thousands of dollars now. This is Beowulf. And Morris tells us, if I was asked to say what it was at once the most important production of art and the thing most to be longed for, I should answer A Beautiful House. And if I were further asked to name the production next in importance and the thing next to be longed for, I should answer A Beautiful Book. And of course, he designed this book, and there are handmade elements to all of the Kelmscott Press works, as there may be said to be of the American emulator of William Morris, the very strange Elbert Hubbard and the Roycrofters in East Aurora, New York. And this is another book from that press. They were much cheaper, much more cheaply produced than the Kelmscott, but obviously highly influenced by William Morris. And medieval manuscripts continued to influence in really curious ways. So this is a printed book from about 1908. This is the printed book, but the binding is made to look exactly like a medieval manuscript. And so it's no surprise that we find in the work of the finest calligrapher of the 20th century, still very influential, his name is Edward Johnston, that he was in fact a neo-medievalist, if you like. And this is one of his, he wrote this out. This is his design for a book of Psalms that's at the Harry Ransom Centre now. And he was also calligraphically foundational in putting together what he called the foundational script from 1906 right the way throughout his life to 1944. And you can see in the bottom right there, that panel is this foundational hand that calligraphers still use and that is still so fundamentally important. And he based it on the 10th century Ramsey Psalter with this really stunningly beautiful round, we call it Caroline or Carolingian minuscule or lowercase. So it's a Caroline hand. And so this is the 10th century manuscript, and this is Edward Johnston's kind of emulation of it in the foundational hand. And it had this profound impact on all calligraphic development. Many women practitioners of this, again, who are only now just beginning to come to the fore and to be appreciated for the fine craftspeople that they are, desiring to emulate the skills and art of the medieval period as a rejection right the way into the 20th century, again, of the industrial. And that's what makes me think that with our love now of artist books and handmade books and fine press books in the digital age, we are kind of running a parallel track, if you like, as a response to the digital world in which we find ourselves. And one of the finest illustrators is in the handmade book exhibition. We own this at Stanford. This is the Song of Songs. It's the key motif for the handmade book. The incredible illumination and decoration in the margins is by Florence Kingsford Cockerell, who was married to Sidney Cockerell, who was the secretary of William Morris. I mean, they all kind of, they were all part of this movement. And that continues to influence the production of artist books and the appreciation of the craft and skill that goes into the manuscript and the way in which it insists on intimacy and our engagement at a level, I think, which is almost outside of kind of gallery art, is almost otherwise unparalleled. So the history and the influence of medieval manuscripts in a nutshell. Thank you. Let me welcome back Claire.
Thank you. That was fabulous. I hope I speak for everyone on the call when I say that, and I say that so many questions that has brought up, and I think just to get us started with a few kind of retrospective thinking back to the beginning of the talk, we have a couple questions on the specific objects you showed. So first, the animal skin music manuscript, which I think was on screen very briefly. That is that. Was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about whether that's a replica, what year it's from, and maybe if it is a replica, what the current practices are around replicating or creating those types of objects.
It's not a replica. It's in my teaching collection. I'm hesitant to open it again because I realized how noisy it was. And this is part of the thing about working with medieval manuscripts, or just looking at them, is the difference in the substrate or the surface upon which one writes. Animal skin has this, it's incredibly durable and resilient. It also has this vibrancy and noisiness about it, which makes working in special collections often really embarrassing, because as you're just turning the pages of quite a large volume, it sounds like you're doing something you shouldn't be doing. And in fact, you're not, you're just turning the page. So this is either very, very late medieval or more likely sort of into the 16th century. It's music. It's obviously from a very large choir book that could be sung from far back by an assembly of choristers. And it's in sharp contrast to that much smaller psalm devotional book that I showed you. So it's hundreds of years old. It's not a replica, but these exist in their thousands, both as individual leaves, which is often because they've been cut out of complete books, or in fact, as we have in this library here, whole antiphonals. On exhibition, and very well-known Stanford book is an antiphonal that belonged to Junipero Serra, who for some is a sainted figure and for others most definitely not. And the book itself weighs, I don't even know, has to weigh 30 to 40 pounds. So and it's huge, it's massive. So it would be very difficult to move around. So yes, so music that my colleagues in the Department of Music can read at sight. I have more difficult, I can read contemporary music, but medieval and early modern music, I find, well, you have to be trained, right? So I don't have the skill set to do that. And there are videos online of singing by choirs, including Jesse Rodan, who's in the music department, his choir, who sang from another antiphonal that Stanford owns at a reception just before we shut down in 2020. So have a look around for that. If I can find the link, I'll have that put onto the resources.
Excellent. I'm sure the Stanford Alumni Association team is getting right on that and searching away. And while they do that, I think we've had a couple of questions around just the meta studying of the content of the books beyond the actual text. So looking at the different styles of the actual writing, a question specifically from Morgan LaRue on acanthus leaves. And I was wondering if you could touch on some of the scholarship around either specifically acanthus leaves or the general study of the objects as kind of as craft and of the different styles and how that can inform kind of your scholarship or others' scholarship.
Yes, that's a very good question. On acanthus leaves specifically, art historians have written about the foliage, the flora, the fauna that is depicted by artists, because it's obviously always going to be specific to the region in which these books were produced. It's often following fashion. So some of the to my mind, some of the most beautiful decorative foliated decoration, so it looks like leaves, is 15th century and peculiar to the Low Countries. So you can, in fact, both date and localize manuscripts according to the very specific motifs and designs put in place there by the artists, who were often actually traveling artists, like professionals who went from place to place, illuminating books for workshops and producers of text. So that's one thing. The other thing that's really interesting, and actually this book, which it's 20th century, right?
Yeah.
But it's so clearly based on medieval designs, not just of script, which is a kind of modernization of late medieval script, but particularly, really interestingly, the color. Because this pink, this, what would you call it? It's cerise, right? This bright, startlingly bright pink is really one of the features that identifies Italian medieval manuscripts. And the palette of choices of pigments, which can either come from plants or from stone, like lapis lazuli, can again be something that you can use to both, specifically to localize manuscripts, and then sometimes allows you to date as well. Of course, there's lots of work being done on DNA of animal skin too, to see if you can tell where the flocks and the herds of the sheep and the cattle came from in this period. So we're in a really interesting moment in the history of manuscript studies, because of new technologies and the different ways in which they allow us to analyze the physical object itself. But in relation to what our questioner is asking, yes, there is a lot of work done by art historians specifically on the motifs and the range of figural and literal devices that are present in the borders of medieval manuscripts.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think you did mention as well the analysis being done on the pigment itself, and it'll be fascinating to see kind of building into those tools and how that helps to inform existing scholarship. You mentioned the intentional margin decorations and motifs. And now Amy has a question from John to ask about some of the content and writing that can be found in the Marginalia, whether it was kind of most likely to be kind of preserved, or whether it was likely to be scrubbed out. And actually, another interesting question on just building on that, whether it was ever copied. So if you ever have cases where there was Marginalia copied from kind of one text to another.
So Marginalia really started me, so it was the marginal that started me off on the research for the book that came out with Oxford last year, on the way that the marginal and marginal annotation in Marginalia had been completely overlooked, or in fact got rid of for centuries. because we're so fixated on the text in the middle of the page, right? The main text in inverted commas, and actually in some cases the marginalia in books, depending on what you're researching, can become the main text. So for example, there's a website called Parker on the Web, and that is run actually from Stanford, but it's the whole collection of manuscripts at Cambridge Corpus Christi College. Claire, you've been there, you've seen these, some of these books. These are digitized on Parker on the Web, and it's fantastic just to spend hours kind of, going through the images and looking at the manuscripts. There's a manuscript called Corpus Christi College, Cambridge 367, and it's 12th century, and it's a book of English laws. And it has, somebody's come along in the early 13th century and they've written some stuff, and nobody had really paid much attention to it. But for me, it became the main text. It's a poem, and it's written out probably by a woman called Matilda, a French poem that's the earliest French beast fable, if you like. It's not, it's not going to change the world necessarily, but it does bring into the fore a previously unknown female writer. It suggests that women could be scribes in ways that we perhaps hadn't really thought about, that we should really start to look again at the marginalia. But she was writing, and not in response to the manuscript. She just saw the margin, had a poem, wrote it down, like you do in a notebook, or you might scribble something into the flyleaf of a book so that you don't forget it. So marginalia can be deeply significant, and Andrew Prescott and I are quite convinced that in the early 20th century, and particularly coming into book sales, medieval manuscripts had their margins washed. It is possible to wash a margin clean of the ink, but of course the traces of it are sort of still there. And it's likely that specialized forms of imaging can help to retrieve some of this, but it's also, you can't persistently image a manuscript. That's going to really seriously damage its physical makeup. So in terms of marginalia being copied into subsequent versions of texts, that definitely does happen. So commentaries especially, scholars go in and they write commentaries in relation to the text that forms the main part of the folio. Those commentaries, together with those texts, do appear in later manuscripts and in fact printed books too. And that tells us something about the transmission of knowledge and its reception into succeeding generations. So marginalia is, one could argue, where it's at. I think there's incredible amounts of things to find in margins beyond drawings and doodles and scribbles and things like that, all of which I would insist need to be taken more seriously, because to be a medieval scribe, you have to be able to get a quill first of all, then know how to cut it, then know how to make the ink from oak galls. And having made the ink with the quill, you'd have to have the book, access to the book for long enough to write in the book, but then you'd also have to know how to write. So this isn't the same as picking up a pencil and just, in our very literate with our Western view of books and margins, it's a much more deliberative act than that.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and it's interesting to think about. You mentioned at the open kind of this resurgence of appreciation for the handmade and the craft, and I wonder if does that change, the modern interpretations of this, where it is so much more accessible to modify and interact with it. Is there kind of a distinction in terms of how the modern audience appreciates these objects in a way that maybe is interactive in a different way, or what have you seen kind of in the modern trends?
Do you mean in terms of like all books, any books, or specifically medieval manuscripts?
Any books.
I don't know. I think we are so hyperliterate that I'm not sure what we like. We love our sort of precious books, or the books that have been passed down to us. In terms of print, like you can't even sell a massive box of paperbacks anymore. You just have to leave it on your driveway for people to pick up. And you go to book sales and books are 5 cents, and there's those free libraries everywhere. There's little cupboards of libraries. There's a couple of them on campus, and you can tell what faculty live nearby by the nature of the books in the mini libraries. So in a sense, I think we undervalue and underappreciate the significance of the book. And this is one thing we can learn from medieval interactors and owners of books, is that that was pretty much the last thing that they did, was undervalue it. And to the point where books that in a sense weren't really necessarily anything much to do with the person who ended up owning them became these treasures, became these heirlooms. And we have one of those on exhibition, which is my favorite manuscript at Stanford. It's called The Libellus, or the Little Book, of Elizabeth of York, wife of Henry VII, who acquired the book from her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, wife of Edward IV, who was probably given the book by monks at Westminster Abbey when she was in sanctuary there. That book became very significant to that family, and it's a church book, it's a service book. So it's, in that sense, there's a kind of slight disjuncture between owner and producer of book, but nevertheless, it was clearly deeply, deeply treasured. And books, some books have that attribute, right? And I would say the vast majority don't, but we can learn that from our medieval predecessors.
I love that. And I think that's a great kind of second to last question and note to wrap up on. And I think just to end our time together, we've had a few questions who have just shown tremendous appreciation for your time and for the content you've covered. And I think people would love to know either where they can hear more from you, learn more about medieval manuscripts, or kind of continue to engage with this content in future ways. So any recommendations, any other opportunities to hear from you, we would love to hear it.
So I think there's a lot of stuff of mine on YouTube, but not all of which I'm sure I authorized, but nevertheless it's there. And especially through the pandemic, when of course we all, all scholars sort of went online, and things got recorded and put up there. So it goes at least 10 years worth of stuff up there on YouTube, a lot of it for the Stanford alumni, that talks more broadly about the history of information technologies. And obviously, I've published a lot, which if you can get it from a library. And our exhibition, if you're in the Bay Area, our exhibition in the Green Library, mine and Ben Albritton's exhibition, is really lovely. It's because our exhibition officer is so remarkable at her job that she turned what was our vision into something really beautiful. And I have this little pocketbook, and if anybody wants one, just write to me at traharn@stanford.edu, and it's a little tiny thin book. It's got that handwriting thing on the back. Click. I'm really happy to post that to you, or you can pick one up at Stanford. So with medieval manuscripts, we have resources, and YouTube is your friend in this case, because there are so many videos of people making books and talking about the making of books, and professional scribes at work. And there's a huge bibliography, plenty of material, and I'd be really happy to share that with you or add to what the Alumni Association are providing for you by way of resources. And all you have to do is drop us the line.
Excellent. I'm sure that would be tremendously appreciated. And with that, our time together today has flown by and come to an end. So thank you so much to all who attended and for your really thoughtful questions.